Safer Sanctuaries, Nurturing Trust Within Faith Communities, is a new and comprehensive resource that continues the tradition of safe sanctuaries ministry by building on its trusted policies and procedures. To learn more, go to safersanctuaries.org or call 800-972-0433. Today's episode of Get Your Spirit in Shape is part of our Meet the Bishop series, where we talk with United Methodist bishops to learn more about their faith journeys. On this episode, we chat with Bishop David Wilson, a member of the Choctaw Nation and the first Native American to be elected as bishop in the United Methodist Church. Bishop Wilson shares with us how growing up in the United Methodist Church has prepared him for his current ministry role, and how Micah chapter 6, verse 8 has been a guide for him throughout his life. Bishop Wilson, welcome to Get Your Spirit in Shape.
Thank you. It's good. It's great to be with you today.
Well, this interview today is a part of our Meet a Bishop series, and that's an opportunity for United Methodists across the connection to get to know you a little bit, not really as a bishop, but as a fellow United Methodist, and to learn about your faith journey, including your call to ministry and your path to being elected bishop. So I'm excited for our conversation today.
Thank you. Me too.
Bishop Wilson, you and I met in early 2020 at an event in Nashville, Tennessee, and I had the opportunity to hear you speak about how important growing up in the church was for you and how it has nurtured you to become a leader. Do you mind starting our conversation with just sharing more about that?
Yeah. Again, thank you for having me. I remember our time there in Nashville. YimCom put on a great event. So I do remember that. The fun part for me as I have been here in the Great Plains is people want to hear my call story and my story. And I forget because been traveling across the conference this week, and the first event they said, well, tell us your call story. Tell us more about you. And I forget that people are interested in hearing story. And so I appreciate sharing that. I grew up in a small Native American congregation in the town of Muskogee, Oklahoma. My family moved there from Tulsa in the mid-'60s, so I've been a part of this United Methodist Church before it was United in 65 as a young child, going to church with my mother there and, church that raised me. And my mother never drove, and so we always seemed to live close to the church and other places, so we'd walk through the park, sometimes further, depending on where we lived. We never lived too far from that local church, and so I have fond memories of that place, and of course at a time, and it was a different time in terms of neighborhoods and the rest, and that local church where I was sharing just yesterday, where people, mostly the mothers of the church, who nurtured me and supported me and encouraged me with anything I did. I was sharing with a group of pastors. I said, I've done everything in the local church you've ever done, cleaning the toilets, cleaning the church, all sorts of things, renting out WASP for the church and other things, teaching Sunday school, leading worship, youth folk, you name it. And that was made possible by my pastor at the time, who I tell people recognized God's call upon my life before I did, and started me out to be involved and taking up offering. Later would be leading in worship, reading this, reading that, and it wasn't just it wasn't just that he would come and say, "Here it is." He would instruct you on how to do it and what to do there. And I remember fondly, and this is from the older communion ritual that was in the 72, I believe it was 72, a hymnal, and he would invite me up, and I'd get to read part of that. And I always remember he would always kneel before the altar table. And I don't recall anyone ever doing that then. And then he would ask me to, read parts of that ritual, which I did. So when I was, by the time I was 15, 16, I had the old ritual memorized there, and still could almost memorize that, and love to use that from time to time, helping with the service of communion. And I remember when he left, he was retiring, he said, "I'm leaving, and the rule for the church is that retired pastors do not come back to the churches. You give the new pastors a chance to acclimate themselves and be in leadership." And he said, "So you folk," he said, "I've done all I can to teach you, so you need to carry on." And we did. I remember leading worship for the longest time. Even in college, attended Oklahoma City University. I would drive back on weekends and just attend church or help with the church there. But the nurturing that local church gave me, not just through him, but through the people of the church who encouraged me, who helped me, who supported me throughout my life, that was pivotal for me. And I still now when I go to my that church, it's a different location. My mother's still living, so my family still attends there. The folk who are in leadership now are the children of those church mothers who are there, including some siblings of mine. So it's always fun to go back. Their grandkids that I taught who are now also some of the leaders in the church. And that is very rewarding to be able to see those folk back in the life of the church who realize and recognize how important that church is.
Bishop Wilson, I love hearing you talk about that because I hear about a legacy that impacted you, but I also hear how you're now part of a legacy that's impacting others.
Oh, yeah.
Going back, those kids are hearing the stories about when you were a little kid in that church, and those teenagers are hearing the stories of when you were helping with liturgy or as a worship leader. And that's just such a beautiful tapestry of how these connections in our church can work.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
You were talking about how you've done everything in the local church, every job. And I would almost say that you may have done everything in the church, period. You've been
yes.
a campus minister, a youth director. You served churches, as clergy. You were a district superintendent, and you served the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference as an assistant to the bishop. Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah. And I think I've served on maybe at least three, maybe four general agencies across the church. So to have that vast experience too of how from global ministries to higher education and ministry, connectional table, and back to global ministries again, which provided some great opportunities to learn about the greater church and how that operates.
Absolutely. And I was thinking that as well, that you have such a unique perspective that you've seen connectionalism, how it works. And can you talk some more about that, what you've experienced and maybe how that's impacted how you view perhaps your role as bishop now?
Yeah, I thank you. I look back to the earlier days doing youth ministry and campus ministry. So we would, participate in probably the very first exploration event, which was an attempt to address the shortage in the early 90s of young people in ministry, and then involved with campus ministry gatherings, international youth gatherings, jurisdictional. And the fun part about that, Crystal, is, of course, you get to meet folk from all over. And then even now serving as bishop, folks will come up to me and say, "Do you remember me? We worked together in youth ministry." And I said, "Of course I remember you." And so it's fun to see those folk, and even some young folk who I've seen, some of the delegates, and said, "You may not remember, but we're part of the South Central jurisdiction, and I was at part of NEMO, JIMO, all the stuff I did for so many years." And the fun part, Crystal, is to continue those relationships across the church, and that's one of the beautiful things about this denomination. We meet friends everywhere we go, colleagues, and also people you can call on for advice or for support or models for how people get to do that. And, even for the general agencies, that was an invaluable experience. When I first worked with higher education ministry in 96, I think through 2000, and had no idea how that worked. And so it's a good, big learning curve. And there are folks there who helped me. We became friends. Again, folk I see now there and help, say, here's how we operate, here's how leadership is built. And even early on, from that point, had been ordained probably 2 or 3 years before that. And so learning how the church worked, but I've always been, and I share this often, a strong advocate for inclusion, for representation. And so everywhere you go, you across the church, you look where Indigenous folk or other folk have or have not been represented. And it was exciting to be a part of that at that first point from, serving on that board and for having other folk, usually racial ethnic folk who helped to nurture me and support me. And I remember once, Crystal, I was at a gathering for campus ministry, and they asked me to do a devotion. I've been to maybe my first kind of national gathering with campus ministers. I'm so nervous. All these folk who've been at it for years, and some I knew their names. And I remember getting up and saying, "I don't know what I'm doing here, why I'm here," and I apologize. I apologize for just something, and afterwards there was a Hispanic person who came to me and said, David, don't you ever do that. Don't you ever apologize for being there where God has placed you. God will work through you, and God will use you. And I always appreciate that, because I was just kind of felt like a small fish in a huge pond, and being around people who've been after ministry for years. And I always remember that. And I share that with other people, especially when I see young folks struggling with work or their role in the church, and to share that. And then, of course, as it went on through boards and agencies, learned so much opportunities to be in leadership, chairing boards and committees there. And even then, Crystal, not really understanding how these bishops were elected, how they got to be where they're at. And I share this often. I'm not trying to be offensive to anybody, but for the longest time, as an Indigenous people, all we saw were older white bishops, and for the longest time, that's who I thought bishops were, and until I began meeting some racial ethnic bishops as I served on the boards and places, and they were always a great encouragement as well.
Well, that's a great segue into talking about your historic election as the first Native American bishop in the United Methodist Church, and this place that we find ourselves this last election, this last round of elections in November of 2022. We had multiple historic elections. It was so exciting for the denomination. I want to talk to you about what that felt like for you personally when that was happening to you. What was going on in your mind? How are you feeling?
That was a amazing election, not just in the South Central, but across the church. And we gathered with the new bishops this past January, so many who were historic first. And that was pretty amazing for us to share stories. I was a candidate since 2012, early on, much younger, of course, and knew it's a long shot, but it was a good experience. And at the time, people said, David, you're too young. You got too many years to serve, this or that. It's always excuses. But other folk did that. Other folk were elected when they were young, with other experience, and they got elected. So it's some of that's different for racial ethnic people, and I think for women who've been in that role. And running again in 16, very close election. I think even there, some reason would like to make history. I think we went to the most ballots ever in the South Central jurisdiction, and that was a difficult process. And I remember somebody asking, so what will you do? What will you do if you're not elected? I said, well, I have an appointment right now in Oklahoma Indian Mission Conference. I'll go back or do my work, ministry. There's much to be done. I'll still pick up where I left off, which I did. And then folk who continued to encourage me to run again in 20, of course, 20 moved on. And then I forgot about it. You get so engrossed in ministry, and everything was up in the air with COVID and with the state of the church. And then when they announced that the elections were going to be held, I said, oh, yeah, the elections are there. So then I had to start getting ready again to get your resume out, your stuff. You start updating it, all those things, via Zoom for the most part with delegations. It had some great support, many, many people across the South Central who encouraged me to run again there. And so when we got to the jurisdiction, of course, we're all anxious and gathering. And so it was quite a shock. When our vote first came up, there were some things happening. Numbers weren't all there for the candidates, this or that, but they went for it. And then they had some struggles there and challenges. And I remember the bishop saying, well, let's see what's going on. And they came back with the list, and he looked dumbfounded. He was like, not sure what to do. And he said, folks, we have 3 elections. So, yeah.
You're making up for what happened in 2016.
I guess so. And so we stood there looking at the names, and people are screaming and cheering. They're still trying to make sense. And then finally, I realized the bishops Merrill and Williamston and myself were elected for that. And of course, seeing folk, and it's fun because I had asked Bishop Harvey. I said, if I'm elected, will you come and escort me? Well, somebody else had asked her too, and so Bishop Nunn was standing there with me, my bishop. And he said, well, we got to wait. Bishop Harvey's kind of popular today. So finally she came around, took me to the stage. And that was such a surreal time. Even some family members who were coming that day got there too late, about 20 minutes. So many people got there too late. No one had any idea 3 people would be elected the first day. There were some people in that jurisdiction who knew it's going to happen. They worked hard for that, and they knew it, and they told us. But just because of what happened in 16, it was kind of just waiting to see what's going to happen. Yeah.
Well, it was an exciting time, that whole,
Yes.
those elections happening, and
Mhm.
we were on getting the news coming in, and, and there were I know there were just cheers across the
Yeah.
connection for those elections. You said something earlier, I want to go back to, you said your minister when you were growing up really recognized the call on your life before you did. When did you recognize the call on your life?
I think back to that, as active as I was as a layperson, as a child, and there was a group. I remember my sisters who were a little bit older, 3 or 4 years older than I was, active with youth group and all that stuff. And I was so excited thinking, when I get to be 12, I get to be a part of that group. Well, when I turned 12, the group disbanded for whatever reason. So I had no youth group. So I was, just thrust in the life of the church of working and serving. And, that it was so ingrained that I never thought about serving as a layperson different from other work. And even family members who would say he'll be a pastor someday. And since junior high, I was always interested in writing. And so even in the seventh, eighth, and ninth grade, I was writing for the school newspaper in junior high school. It's in the old days of mimeograph. And I remember we'd have Thursday, we'd get it together and get this done. So I was a reporter and went to high school and wrote articles for a larger high school till we moved to a smaller school, and editor of that little paper, again, a mimeograph paper there. And then, so I went to college on journalism scholarships. I was a editor of my paper in junior college for a year, and went on to Oklahoma City University. I was a copy editor scholarship. So that's how I got through college. And all that time, always involved in, and two stints, and many of my family and others don't recall, our pastor had to leave for some reason. So I was licensed for one semester at our church. And that experience. And then another pivotal point, when I was finishing my undergrad mass communications, I did an internship with the General Board of Church and Society, a racial ethnic local church piece there, and served for a summer in Washington, D.C., worked in the office of Congressman Ben Nyhorst Campbell, who was the only Native American in Congress at that time. He was a House rep, and got to work with the press secretary, and I got to do a whole lot. It was fun. I mean, 34th week, they kind of let me loose, and that was a great experience. And then every week we would have gatherings at the building, talk about racial justice, social justice, the work of the board. And that helped me to finally realize when I got done, I said, okay, I got to get down to business and make that call, and declare candidacy, and then finishing college and undergrad, and then going on to seminary there, and then took off from there. So all those always in the back of my mind. I don't know if I wasn't just facing it, or just knowing how active I was as a layperson. I didn't see the difference at that time before that call.
Before we continue our conversation with Bishop Wilson, I'd like to tell you about a new resource titled Safer Sanctuaries, Nurturing Trust Within Faith Communities. This comprehensive resource continues the tradition of Safe Sanctuaries ministry by building on the trusted policies and procedures that have guided churches for more than 25 years. This resource contains theological grounding for the work of abuse prevention, psychological insights about abuse and abuse prevention, basic guidelines for risk reduction, age-level specific guidance, and step-by-step instructions on how to develop, revise, update, and implement an abuse prevention plan in your church or organization. For Christians, resisting evil and doing justice are ways that we live and serve Jesus Christ. Safer Sanctuaries provides helps to do just that by framing this work as a life-giving, community-enhancing, and proactive endeavor. It enables communities to be empowered and flourish as they develop and implement policies and procedures that make everyone safer. To learn more, go to safersanctuaries.org or call 800-972-0433. Now let's hear more from Bishop Wilson. You talked about being involved when you were in working for the congressman, being involved with racial justice and social justice, and then you said earlier you acknowledge the truth about that. Indigenous people, there's inequity for Indigenous
Mhm.
people. There's inequity for for different ethnicities, And that's been something that you have worked on, not just inside the church, but in the community.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
can you talk some about that work?
Sure. I've always, for whatever reason, and maybe it's just from where I was at, and in college, I think even for some of racial ethnic focus, sometimes college is the time when we find ourselves, when we begin to claim who we are. And for myself, as a racial ethnic person, some of that goes back to the local church had great role models for being native folk and Christian folk. Other places that wasn't always the case. So there were times that you look around at what's happening, and although I grew up with a lot of native families in my neighborhoods, we weren't always proud to be native, if that makes sense. And it has to do with family structures and the rest that I won't go into. But college is a time when you realize this is who I am, be proud of who you are, learning more from counselors, advisors, and others about that, and that helps to take off. And so even since college, being a strong advocate for Native folk, and whether it's around mascots or whether it's around just inclusion. And the last work lately has been around voter engagement for Indigenous folk and working some on issues of mascots with the general boards, and just representation, simple things, Crystal, like, and there'd be times when publications would come out and folk who aren't familiar with us, they find what they can find on the computer and the rest, not always accurate. And so there were times I'd have to call them up and say, that's not a good representation of who we are. And so when the boards and agencies and others would hear that, they would say, well, can you help us? And so we do that. And we say, here's who we are, producing a document, here's some photos, whatever we need to say, here's how diverse we are as Indigenous peoples there. And so I get to do a lot of that for all of our agencies across the church. Worked with them all, some in advisory, some just they know me, and they know me from years of work and doing that. And so that's been pivotal. But just knowing we come from a conference made up of all Native folk, that's all I knew all my life. And then when you get away from that, you don't see that. And so always calling for representation, and for many in the church, it's defined as black and white. And I have to remind people often, I said, we are so much more diverse than that. And not only speaking up for Indigenous peoples, but for others who are not represented for that. I recall one instance, working with voter engagement for Native folk. I've done that since 2002. Myself and two other young adults who are both now pastors, one a deacon, one an elder, inspired by someone who talked about Native folk not being involved. And we did off and on with the big elections. And so in 17, 18, received some funding from a national agency to do that, and really picked up and took off and did much work around that. And I was at a gathering during the census. They asked us to come and help make sure Native folk are represented. So they made it posters and everything. And they said, go to your table and you'll find your your posters, buttons, whatever, and take as many as you want. Well, I looked around and didn't see us anywhere. This is in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, 39 tribes in the state. Looked around again, it wasn't there. And I said, where's our posters and the rest? She said, oh, we're going to get, she stumbled. She said, we'll get there. And I was fuming then. And the gathering's about to start. Influential people across the city, school board folk, state superintendent, council folk. Finally, halfway through, they were showing a presentation. I said, folk, I'm sorry, I got to say this. I said, we're in Oklahoma City, thinking about the Native representation in the city and in the state. And I said, we're not represented anywhere in this room on this, that, and this. And I said, what's even more difficult is that no one else in this room noticed but me. And so that's what we deal with all the time. And so many places, even in the general church, where we have been left out. And almost every single time I pick up the phone and I call most of these people I know. I'll call them up and say, hey, do you know what you've done here? And we're always cordial. But there's still that kind of work to do. And I think even now, which I've realized, been on the job for 2 months as of March 1st, and becoming, because I'm Indigenous, people calling upon me for all sorts of Native stuff, Native issues there. But also recognizing before my election, Crystal, on the Council of Bishops, there were no Indigenous people, no one to speak for our issues, except for the bishops who've served in areas where there's a large representation. Bishop Stanosky, who's done a great job of educating folk about the Sand Creek Massacre. Bishop Nunn, who really advocates for the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference, wherever he happens to be at. And so this will be a role that I unofficially take on of being a spokesperson for Native issues, representation, and the rest.
Such an important voice that's needed
Mhm.
in the church,
Yes.
in our culture. So it's needed and it's important. And you're in a space now where you can talk about these things, and there are people maybe listening in a way that they weren't before.
Yeah, and what's interesting, and have been sharing this with people at my installation in this area. There's several boarding schools, and so the tribes are wanting more access and more input than what they've been given, and came to my installation and others. And a friend of mine who came, who's also working on this with the Lutheran Church, I told him, I said, it's interesting to see how much influence a bishop has. Before, when I was just assistant to the bishop for the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference, there are people who listen, but when you're a bishop, people really listen, and that's hard to wrap my head around. I'm not saying that to be bragging about that. People know that you're representing in the Great Plains over 800 churches in 2 states, and they realize the influence that you have as a bishop. And even for the non-step, when I first arrived, new governor was being reelected, and I said, well, I'd like to go to her interfaith service, and staff got me on there. I got to speak. And what was fun, by the time I finished later, people had said, Bishop Wilson was there from the Great Plains, and he talked about all the things that they're doing, and which was pretty cool to know. First of all, people knew who I was. Governor Kelly, who's there, also recognized that. First Indigenous bishop listed. But also, what was the best part was to see how people know what the United Methodist Church is doing in the Great Plains. That's pretty cool.
That's
Yeah,
very cool.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
that is. I know that feels good.
It does. And I've been back twice, and and I see the same players. I said, I want to have fun with you, folk, because I can see the work that you do around social justice, which is one of my passions. That, of course, around Micah 6:8, what does the Lord require of us but to do justice, to love kindness, and walk humbly with God. I mean, and all week I've seen that everywhere I go, and it's just a reinforcement of the people I get to serve with and work with, which is great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You said earlier that you just got back into the office, and
Yeah.
you've been going around to the Nebraska and
Hmm.
Kansas,
Hmm.
meeting the people in the congregations that you're serving. What are you most hopeful for as you're going through across the conference and meeting the
Yeah.
different United Methodists that you're serving?
Thank you. Yes, I've been on the road since Tuesday, from one end of the state in Kansas to the other. And first of all, the excitement. There's so much excitement about what lies ahead. So much work, so much talk around disaffiliation. The Great Plains has done a good job of handling that so well. Folk have been very amiable. Folk are ready to put that behind us because, as I said, we got great work to do. We can do what we're called to do: ministry and mission for the church and for God's people. And I've seen that excitement all across. People energized, ready to get after it, and they still are. It's not that this has stopped many, but just tired of hearing about this. And so after, looking forward to just getting to meet more people, and so much great ministry going everywhere. I mean, I've heard so many stories of personal transformation. Look what local churches are doing. For instance, when I was in Lawrence, here in local churches who are doing some great ministry, and then got to visit a local church, about 6 to 8 churches who come together to operate a thrift store in Hutchinson, Kansas. Most United Methodists who run the show make about $30,000 a year, charging a quarter and 50 cents for clothing, and then at the very, very end they give it all away to different agencies, including United Methodist Committee on Relief. And so you think about the power, what it means for folk to work together. And one of the neat things, Crystal, about that, besides these great people running it, one of the churches who are with that group is a church that has disaffiliated, but they're still working with them. So I just see we in the church can all still work together, and we're all in a common cause, serving Christ and going out to transform the world. And then last night I got to meet an incredible group housed in one of our churches, helping lift people out of poverty. And so this is the project where the folk who are living in poverty, they lead the discussions. I mean, who knows best how to understand poverty than those in poverty? Then they partner them with two other folk from the middle class, and they work together for 18 months to help get these folk in other places, not to instruct and say, here's what you should do, that do not do, but to coach them. And I got to meet some incredible women who mastered this, who've been taken out of poverty. and who are now teaching, helping to lead other women and men. I think, man, what an incredible model for ministry. And I share often, when the four foci of the church minister to the poor, and that's what the United Methodist Church does the worst. We don't know how to do that. We're middle class, upper class denomination. We don't know how to work with the poor. And so it's a wonderful model, and just still energized and hoping we can find ways to expand that and to model that. So those kinds of stories that I get to hear and to see continuously lives being transformed from ministry. Met some folk at Church of the Resurrections and some gentlemen been incarcerated for years and years and incarcerated unjustly. And churches like Resurrection and others help them through that, part of that ministry. I thought, this is amazing stories. It makes me feel good about, I have nothing to do with any of these, but I get to be a part of, connected with these ministries. And that's fun. That's rewarding.
Gives you a lot of hope, doesn't it?
A lot of hope. It sure does. And there's more stories like that across this conference and across the church. I know everything's been focused on disaffiliation. So I've really working with our media to say, we got to make sure let's highlight these great stories. People need to hear them, and we need to share those stories. And that's just been amazing.
Well, Bishop Wilson, before we finish up today, there is one question that we always ask our guest on Get Your Spirit in Shape, and that is, how do you keep your own spirit in shape?
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great question. For years and years, that's probably been my biggest challenge in all my roles, that you get focused on ministry and there's always so much to be done that you sometimes overwork that. And I always knew when I got to a point when I was worn out, I get sick and worn out. And I learned from that finally. And the last many years, taking up physical routines of running, exercising, now here since I've moved, I haven't found it yet. I tried, not successful, finding groups that you work with in terms of running, working out, fitness groups, and that's been really fun. And the other piece too, Crystal, is to be among people who don't know me as a bishop. When I was with that group last night, they didn't. I mentioned who I was. They could care less. They didn't know what a bishop is there, and so it's often fun to be with people who know me as David and not Bishop Wilson, who can act like they're going to act anywhere else. Because the minute they find out you're a pastor, bishop, it changes. And so I do my best to go incognito so people don't know me, so I can be who I am. And that's a healthy place for me to be at. And you sometimes always get pulled into ministry, even in the midst of that, but that's rewarding. And to get to, do gracious work down. I was visiting with Bishop Carlo Rapanaut today. He's a long distance runner. Moved from Alaska to Phoenix. I said, Carlo, so how have you adjusted to that running routine? And so we were talking about that and about the challenges, and those are things that sustain us because it sustains me physically and spiritually as well. And then, of course, the other place, Crystal's, be around family and friends who know me well and can be yourself, and who keep me humble and who remind me who I am for that. And then, of course, remaining connected to my culture. When my local church had it going away, one of the women, known for years since college, Choctaw, she said, David, and they're still coming David, that's how they know me, don't you forget you're a Choctaw. That's my tribe. And I thought about that as I left. I thought, thank you. To remember who I am, where I come from, the culture that helps define me, and ministry that I use often in terms of values. And so those are things that sustain me in my life. And of course, my spiritual journey of prayer and spiritual disciplines of scripture and listening to other people doing what they're doing in ministry, podcast, and hearing the different ways people understand scriptures and understand their relationship with God. So that feeds me. And but I really have to work hard at that because this job, even before this job, is so easy to immerse yourself in it. That I really have to be very intentional about working on that, which is a challenge, but getting there.
That's a good reminder. I mean, to make space and time for that.
Yes.
It's very important.
Yes. And the fun part, people on the Great Plains have asked me, how are you taking care of yourself? And so I appreciate that. Just yesterday, 2 people said, how are you taking care of yourself? And I appreciate that much for folks to ask me that.
That's a loving question, isn't it?
It is. It's rewarding. And so they want me to be in good shape, and that made me feel good.
Yeah. Bishop Wilson, this has been such a delight to have you, as a guest on Get Your Spirit in Shape, and just bless you as you go about in your as you serve the the people of the Great Plains Conference.
Thank you, Crystal. It's good to see you again as well.
Thank you.
Uh,
That was Bishop David Wilson discussing his call to ministry and his journey to becoming the first Native American elected to the role of bishop in the United Methodist Church. To learn more about Bishop Wilson and his ministry, go to umc.org/podcast and look for this episode, where you will find helpful links and a transcript of our conversation. If you have questions or comments, feel free to email me at a special email address just for Get Your Spirit in Shape listeners, gysis@umcom.org. If you enjoyed today's episode, we invite you to leave a review on the podcast platform where you listen. Thank you so much for joining us for Get Your Spirit in Shape. I'm Crystal Cavanis, and I look forward to the next time that we're together. Today's Get Your Spirit in Shape episode was sponsored by a new resource from the Upper Room and Discipleship Ministries titled Safer Sanctuaries, Nurturing Trust Within Faith Communities. This comprehensive resource continues the tradition of Safe Sanctuaries ministry by building on its trusted policies and procedures. The resource contains theological grounding for the work of abuse prevention, basic guidelines for risk reduction, age-level specific guidance, and step-by-step instructions on how to develop, revise, update, and implement an abuse prevention plan. To learn more, go to safersanctuaries.org or call 800-972-0433.